On February 25th, 1974, in the sleepy town of Necedah, Wisconsin, a police shootout ended with 2 men dead in the woods. Around 9:30 a.m., Henry Binkowski, a World War II veteran with what we'd now call PTSD, started brandishing a rifle and demanding his brother Val. The local dentist's wife, Betty, overheard the commotion and called her friend Gert for help. Gert suggested she call Ray Pritzl, the obvious protocol in this circumstance. Ray was the right-hand man of Maryanne Vanhoof, the woman behind the Necedah Shrine, known locally as the Advocate, designated as such by the Virgin Mary herself. Of course, Ray would know what to do. Betty called Gert back a few minutes later. Ray and Marianne were busy having their Monday morning meeting. Betty and Gert were worried, of course, but they thought the situation could still be resolved on its own. After all, Henry Binkowski was generally a peaceful, well-liked guy. He often complained about his brother, but this time was different. When Gert suggested calling the police, Betty relayed that Ray and Marianne said absolutely not. Calling the cops would make them look bad. Instead, Betty and Gert called Tommy Huber, Henry's best friend. Tommy did his best to calm Henry down while walking, to no avail. The pair went into the Binkowski house, and the crack of gunfire followed. Gert and Betty pleaded with Marianne to be allowed to do something. They held firm. Calling the police would jeopardize the reputation of the shrine, which had tight control over the town. Panic set in. As bullets hit neighboring houses, Tommy ran out of the house, bleeding from his face and hand, and asked for help from a neighbor. Shortly thereafter, though, he ran back towards Henry's house, refusing to give up on helping his friend. The gunfire stopped for a few minutes, and the neighborhood held their breath. Then, a single shot rang out, and Tommy collapsed in a bloody heap on the ground. Everything was silent. Gert decided that, even at risk of being ostracized by the shrine's inner circle, she would finally call the police. Jimmy Rotund, a 24-year-old rookie cop and family friend of Gert, answered, and on his way over he picked up Gert's son Joe. Joe stayed in the squad car while Jimmy cautiously approached the Binkowski home. No one answered, so they both walked to the back of the house, where they saw Tommy's body. A bullet flew past their heads, and they sprinted back to the car. Jimmy called the county sheriff for backup. As more cops showed up from neighboring townships and the county, Henry continued firing at anyone and everyone. Thus began the shootout. Henry had seemingly unlimited ammunition, and when the cops began running low, one deputy threw the first of many tear gas canisters through a basement window. Henry was holding off 20 officers at this point, and tear gas was filling his house. He refused to surrender as he was still waiting for his real target, his brother Val, to come home. Val arrived around 4 p.m. to a large crowd of cops barricading his house and an even larger crowd of spectators, over 7 hours after Betty had first called Gert about Henry's erratic behavior. Not knowing that Val was Henry's target, the parish priest, Father Cassidy, suggested that Val try to call his brother out of the house. He got as far as, "Come on, Henry, this is Val," before Henry opened fire once again. As the sun set, he showered the crowd with bullets. One hit a cop in the hip. A tear gas bomb was thrown through another basement window, finally forcing Henry out. Firing off a few final shots, he was hit by a ricochet bullet and stumbled through the back door with a near-empty rifle in his hands. Riddled with gunshot wounds from 3 directions, Henry collapsed on the ground, dead, after a 6-hour standoff. What made Henry Binkowski snap? Why didn't anyone call the cops until Tommy was already dead? You see, Necedah at the time was more or less a tiny island of theocracy, ruled by Maryanne Vanhoof and her second-in-command, Ray Pritzl. For the last 25 years, Marianne claimed the Virgin Mary visited her regularly to dispense messages ranging from the impending apocalypse to the optimal driving speed. Marianne built a shrine in the forest east of town, officially called the Queen of the Holy Rosary Mediatrix Between God and Man Shrine, Inc., which had a thorny relationship with the official Catholic hierarchy. Over time, Marianne had consolidated power, creating what journalists at the Madison-based Capital Times called the Shrine Belt, the tight-knit community of a few hundred devoted followers in the woods of central Wisconsin. Val was one of those devotees, and for a long time Henry had been upset with how much of their money went to the shrine. Henry believed that Val was even planning on turning over their house to the shrine, which obviously made him upset. The precipitating factor for the February 25th incident, however, was the shrine's 8 points doctrine. Henry had recently run out of his tranquilizing medication he relied on to cope with his shell shock, and Val refused to drive him to a neighboring town to get more. Instead, Henry was given herbal remedies by two herb ladies, Molly Defoe and Maria Prostino. Both women were Hoofers, as Marianne's followers were often called. All Hoofers were expected to live by the shrine's 8 points, which, among other things, discouraged modern medicine in favor of natural cures. In the weeks leading up to the tragedy, neighbors had reported Henry behaving in increasingly erratic ways, such as pounding on Gert's door late at night. She had told Ray her concerns about Henry's well-being, but nothing was done. Gert was later shunned on the orders of the Chosen Ones, the 33 people closest to Marianne, for her betrayal of their self-imposed isolation. When reporters investigated this incident about 6 years later, they found that all official records were missing. There was nothing to be found with the county sheriff's department, the coroner, the court reporter, or district attorney. Not a peep from local news about it either. This is a long and winding story with too many odd characters to count. The history of the Necedah Shrine is complex and at times incoherent, featuring a revolving door of eccentrics, scam artists, and ne'er-do-wells. One local man said in 1980 that place draws the screwiest people in the world. And boy did it. This story is screwy, even by my standards, and I'm your host, Tor Parsons. These are my co-hosts, Thimble the Doll, Siegfried the Slug, and Jollibee the Durian, and this is another holy episode of Tor's Cabinet of Curiosities. The Tor store is popping off. People really like this new design with Thimble ready for a fight. There's the iconic Vaporwave Jollibee, all the curiosities, plain old America's favorite durian. You can get them on shirts, you can get them on mugs, mousepads, stickers to spread the gospel of curiosity. You can get them all at torscabinet.com/STOR. Half the profits on every sale go to the artist. To understand the Necedah Shrine, one has to understand the phenomenon of Marian apparitions. A Marian apparition is essentially when someone sees the Virgin Mary physically in their environment, not in a dream or anything, as if they could reach out and touch her. Often she appears to give a message to the visionary. It is distinct from, although related to, other phenomena such as spiritual visions, moving or weeping statues, and intercessory miracles. Apparitions can also be of other religious figures, such as Jesus or various saints, but Mary is the most common and most relevant to this topic. Apparitions have been reported since the Middle Ages and are particularly associated with Roman Catholicism in Western Europe. From the mid-19th century, there's been a revival of reported Marian apparitions after centuries of decline due to the Protestant Reformation and Inquisition. Religion for Breakfast has a great video about Marian apparitions in general, so watch that for a more in-depth assessment. The Catholic Church has a rigorous and incredibly autistic process for approving apparitions for official veneration. Allow me to note that in my recent video about saints, which also touched on this process, I got a lot of Catholics in my comments telling me Catholics don't worship saints. The terminology I used in the video, you only worship God. You venerate saints, including Mary. I wasn't raised particularly religious, and I genuinely didn't know those words weren't synonyms, so thank you all for letting me know. Apparitions are considered private revelations, meaning they aren't given any credence by the official church until formal approval. They are thoroughly investigated for supernatural merit, moral and theological orthodoxy, and benefit to the community. An apparition can be judged negatively, neutrally, positively, or simply left alone to wait and see if it bears good spiritual fruit. Apparitions are assessed up through the hierarchy, so if a local bishop deems an apparition as having merit, then it'll be referred to the Archbishop, the relevant National Conference of Bishops, and eventually the Vatican. Generally, the Catholic Church takes a highly skeptical approach to apparitions, so only a handful of them have ever been given Vatican approval. The vast majority of them never even get local approval. The most popular apparition by far is that of Lourdes in southern France, with the shrine attracting millions and millions of pilgrims every year. Other major mainstream apparition shrines include Guadalupe in Mexico, Knock in Ireland, and Fatima in Portugal, which I mentioned in passing in my David Woodard video. The Miracle of Fatima, in which, in keeping with time-honored Tours Cabinet tradition, I mispronounced it. Champion in eastern Wisconsin is another very popular apparition shrine based on the appearances of Mary to a young Belgian woman in 1859. According to tradition, Mary later protected the chapel where dozens of people were sheltering from the Great Peshtigo Fire of 1871, which remains the deadliest wildfire in recorded history. Our Lady of Champion is still the only approved Marian apparition in the United States. Now, preempting the comments section, this video is not about disproving Marian apparitions, or proving them, for that matter. Whether the children at Fatima or Adelbrise in Champion actually received messages from the Virgin Mary is irrelevant. Lots of people believe they did. Marian apparitions have become incredibly influential in popular Catholic consciousness, and I'll discuss them as if they're real because it's a lot simpler to do that than have an asterisk clarification after every mention of the phenomenon. Marian apparitions are mostly pretty harmless, and generally Mary gives standard messages about praying more, attending Mass, giving to the poor, spreading the gospel, and so on. Hundreds of apparitions have been reported in the last 200 years, and most of them are something like this. Mary appears to someone, usually a rural peasant and/or child, and she tells them to be a good Catholic and that Jesus loves them. Perhaps she grants some miracle as a sign of God's presence and protection of the community. Sometimes, however, Mary gets weird. Ever since Our Lady of Fatima allegedly predicted World War II and communist persecution of religion, many apparitions have taken on an apocalyptic, conspiracist flavor. When the Cold War bubbled up, yes, this is another Cold War episode, it set off a chain reaction of increasingly strange Marian apparitions. The post-World War II Marian revival in the US and Europe was heavily influenced by the ideas popularized at Fatima a couple decades prior. More than any other apparition, Fatima has fueled the peculiarly American form of Catholic apocalypticism as expressed in Necedah and in other similar sightings across the US, because this isn't the only one. The core of Fatima's apocalypticism is the supposed secrets that the Virgin told to the visionary children. Lucia, one of the children, who later became a nun, said that Mary had told them a 3-part secret. She refused to tell anyone what it was until 1941, when she revealed the first and second parts in a memoir. The first secret was a horrifically violent image of hell. The second was a request that the Pope consecrate Russia to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. The Virgin supposedly said, "If my requests are heeded, Russia will be converted, and there will be peace. If not, she will spread her errors throughout the world, causing wars and persecutions of the Church. The good will be martyred, the Holy Father will have much to suffer, various nations will be annihilated." Pope Pius XII, and later Pope John Paul II, took Lucia seriously, and consecrated not only Russia, but the entire world, to the Heart of Mary. Die-hard Fatimaniacs, though, an actual term in Catholic circles, maintain that neither pope did it correctly. The third secret remained, well, a secret. Lucia supposedly put it to writing, but the Virgin told her to keep it in a sealed envelope and not reveal it until 1960. 1960 came and went, though, and every pope since John the 23rd has declined to publicize it. Needless to say, ever since the 1940s, the third secret of Fatima has been a major nucleus for Catholic conspiracy theories. Wild speculation on what it says and why it's kept under wraps has swirled ever since, especially in America during the Cold War. It's perfect fodder for this sort of thing. Could Mary have warned of nuclear holocaust, World War III, a false pope? Over time, this faded in the broader American Catholic consciousness, and by the 1960s, the Fatima craze was seen as somewhat antiquated. However, not everyone let go of it. In 1945, a Dutch woman named Ida Peterman claimed Mary had visited her and called herself the Lady of All Nations. Of course, she warned of the dangers of communism and atheism. Mary also supposedly promised a 5th Marian dogma would be announced. Marian dogma referring to the most important Catholic doctrines about Mary. This kind of prediction of new doctrines dropping is a clear mirror to the secrets at Fatima. The new dogma would be that of Mary as co-redemptrix, mediatrix, and advocate, an extremely controversial idea that has been floating around previously but has never been widely accepted. The concept of the Virgin Mary being co-redemptrix, mediatrix, and advocate is, very briefly, essentially the idea that Mary participated in Christ's redemption of humanity on the cross, and that she's the chief mediator between God and man, putting Mary on almost equal footing with Jesus. Needless to say, it's fringe. It keeps popping up in these Cold War apparitions, though. Tangential to this story, but in the 1970s, a Quebecois woman would start a cult, initially called the Army of Mary, and later renamed to the Community of the Lady of All Nations, based off the Dutch apparitions. It claimed that its founder was a reincarnation of the Virgin Mary. In 1948, Teresita Castillo, a young nun in progress at a convent in the Philippines, claimed she was visited by Mary as well. Similar to the Dutch apparition, Mary claimed the title Mediatrix of All Grace. The deeply Catholic Philippines was freshly independent and firmly in the Western sphere of influence, so it's fertile ground for this sort of thing. Shortly after the Chinese Communist victory in 1941, Teresita claimed that Mary predicted a Chinese invasion of the Philippines. Obviously, that didn't come to pass. Her apparitions were declared non-supernatural, but Maryanne Vanhoof in Wisconsin is said to have heard about the Philippine apparitions and been interested in them. Necedah brought this Cold War Marian niche to the United States. For some time in the McCarthyist era, Necedah was a major hub for paranoid American Catholics to seek reprieve from their fear of communist persecution. Mary's supposed messages spoke to them personally as Americans and to their particular circumstances and anxieties. After all, what could be more validating than the Mother of God saying exactly what you already believed? Wisconsin in particular was the perfect place for this sort of paranoia to manifest. It's the state that produced both Joseph McCarthy himself and the sewer socialists of Milwaukee, forever a swing state. In fact, the McCarthy hearings on communist infiltration started just a few months before 100,000 people would show up at the Vanhoof farm hoping for a miracle. And as the Red Scare slowly cooled off through the latter 20th century, Necedah kept chugging along, as if it was still the 50s. Maryanne Vanhoof was born Anna Maria Bieber in Philadelphia in 1909. Her family moved to Kenosha in southeastern Wisconsin while she was a small child, where she grew up helping out on the farm. Little is known about her early life, but she seems to have had a difficult childhood, facing poverty and possibly having been abused or mistreated by her father. At 18, she moved back to Philly and became a waitress. She met and fell in love with a man there, and they got married and had one child. Bizarrely, Maryanne later discovered that the supposed justice of the peace who had married them was a fraud, and the couple separated. She moved back to Kenosha, where she fell seriously ill. While in the hospital, she had her first mystical vision, a crucifix floating off the wall and hanging in front of her. Maryanne met her first real husband, Godfred Vanhoof, by answering an ad for a housekeeper in the Wisconsin Farmer and Agriculturalist in 1934. Godfred was 16 years her senior, and they got married 4 months after Maryanne began working for him. After losing their Wisconsin farm during the Great Depression, they worked as sharecroppers in the American Southwest for a few years before returning to Wisconsin in the early 1940s and finally settling in Necedah in 1944. Necedah is in many respects a standard Wisconsin small town of around 3,000 people. In the late 1940s, it was around 900, and most of the things that are weird about it today are a result of the shrine. It has a defunct newspaper building, a quaint antique store, a Polish deli, a handful of bars, and of course, a Quick Trip. It's in Juneau County, this will be relevant later, not too far away from a number of more prominent locales like Wisconsin Rapids, Mauston, Adams, Friendship, Tomah, and Wisconsin Dells, a surreal, tacky tourist town that shares the nickname Redneck Vegas with Branson, Missouri, and Pigeon Forge, Tennessee. Necedah is 98% white as of the 2020 census and has strong Polish Catholic heritage centered around St. Francis Catholic Church. When Maryanne began seeing Mary in 1949, she and Godfred had 7 children between the ages of 3 and 17. Whether their oldest child was Maryanne's from her previous fake husband is unclear. She hadn't been raised as a practicing Catholic, although she had been baptized as a baby, and her parents had left the church during her childhood. Her mother was apparently a prominent member of the Spiritualist Assembly in Kenosha. Godfred, however, was a staunch and devout Catholic, who pulled Maryanne back into the faith after they got married. On November 12, 1949, around 11 p.m., Maryanne lay in bed suffering from heart and kidney ailments. She was known to have had neurotic seizures since the 1930s, which would follow her until her death. At 40, she already had a difficult life, marked by poor health, poverty, and personal insecurity. While praying to Jesus and Mary in bed, she heard a noise in the hall and got up to investigate. A figure, about human height and wearing a veil, began to approach her. Marianne closed her eyes, but when she opened them, the figure was still there. Terrified, she ran back into her room and huddled in bed with her back to the figure. Eventually, she looked back, and the figure was gone. She fell asleep, not knowing this would become the defining moment of her life. Marianne didn't tell anyone about this experience for a month, for fear that they would think she was crazy. She didn't know what to make of the figure. Was it a saint, a ghost, a demon? When she told her husband, it was him who first suggested that it was the Virgin Mary. He thought that Mary had come not in response to the troubles that plagued their family, but because of the sins of the wicked world. Understandably distressed, Marianne spent the next several months furiously praying that she be forgiven for turning her back on the spirit. On the night of April 7th, 1950, Good Friday, Marianne was again lying in bed, unable to sleep due to her heart pain. She saw the crucifix on her wall glow, and heard the Virgin Mary's voice saying that, while her cross was heavy to bear, the world faced a greater burden of sorrow unless she would pray. Mary told Marianne to tell the parish priest to tell everyone to pray the rosary every night. Talk about convoluted. If she did this, Mary would return, quote, where and when the flowers bloom, trees and grass are green. Marianne had long been struggling with the feeling that her poor health made her a failure of a wife and mother. Now, however, Marianne's suffering became a holy virtue. Her sickliness was a sacrifice on behalf of the sinful world around her. Today, the Shrine's website describes Marianne as a victim soul, which is a somewhat esoteric concept in Catholicism. A victim soul is someone who's destined to experience immense suffering in imitation of Christ, as a sort of sacrifice for the blessing and forgiveness of others, and their prayers are considered especially powerful. Unlike a scapegoat in its original sense, a victim soul is totally willing. A number of saints and historical figures, mostly in the 19th and early 20th centuries, have been described as victim souls, but it's not an officially sanctioned title, nor an orthodox idea, and you only hear about it in very niche circles these days. It's of its time. Marianne kept seeing apparitions. From May 28th through 30th, 1950, May 28th being Pentecost Sunday, she saw a mysterious blue mist and the Virgin in her yard, near 4 ash trees at noon every day. This spot would later become known as the sacred spot, the most special part of the shrine. Mary told her that she has to fast and attend Mass for 15 days as penance for those who had not heeded her call to pray the rosary daily, and that she would return on June 4th, June 16th, August 15th, and October 7th, the Feast of the Rosary, to give a final penance if people continued to disobey. The first public apparition happened on June 4th, Trinity Sunday, with 28 people, including the parish priest, Father Langowski, present. On June 16th, Feast of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, another previously announced apparition drew 1,500 witnesses. Marianne's personal influence grew, with someone even asking her to pray over their sick baby. Pilgrims and reporters tried to get into the Vanhoof farmhouse, asking her incessant questions, bringing mementos from their travels to other Marian shrines, and asking for her prayers. When they were barred from actually entering the house, they climbed on the fences and farm buildings, even breaking a cellar door. One visitor, a Filipino-Irish woman from Chicago named Juliet Hughes, quote, made herself right at home at the Vanhoof farm. She had come to spread belief in the aforementioned apparitions in the Philippines and had brought with her a rose petal that had supposedly fallen in a miraculous shower from heaven. Marianne was totally frazzled by all of this, obviously. Much of this excitement was driven by an organized publicity campaign led by Henry Swan, the president of Necedah's Chamber of Commerce. Swan's committee distributed tens of thousands of pamphlets and bought radio ads all over the country. This campaign was massively influential among Catholics in the Midwest, and the upcoming Feast of the Assumption in August was set to see unprecedented crowds in Necedah. At the same time, in the summer of 1950, the Diocese of La Crosse began investigating the apparitions and placed Father Claude Heithaus, a Jesuit professor of archaeology at Marquette University, at the head of the investigating committee. The diocese, however, realized by July that the frenzy was getting out of control. Full investigations can take years, so in the meantime they started releasing statements criticizing the literature that was being distributed and warning faithful Catholics against visiting the Vanhoof farm. They stopped short of formally condemning the shrine since they hadn't completed an investigation. On August 9th, Bishop Tracy urged Catholics to not attend the planned Assumption Mass at the shrine. To this end, he formally prohibited the celebration of open-air Mass there, and reminded everyone that the 2 normal Masses at St. Francis's Church would go ahead. However, by August 14th, it was obvious that thousands of people were going to be ignoring the diocese's statements and going to Necedah anyway. As a compromise, Tracy allowed for Mass to be said at St. Francis every half hour starting at 4 a.m., so that pilgrims would not be missing their obligation to the holy day. On August 15th, the Feast of the Assumption, over 100,000 people gathered at the Vanhoof farm, including priests, nuns, laypeople, and dozens of reporters from all over the country. Many of them were eagerly waiting to see the expected apparition, while others were skeptical but curious. At this point, the shrine was little more than a statue of the Virgin Mary on a roughly built wooden altar, surrounded by flower vases. Journalistic accounts describe the crowd trampling all over Mary's flower beds and corn, and rattling rosaries in her face, asking for blessings. Scholar of Marian apparitions, Sandra Zimders-Schwartz, describes the scene as, quote, sanctified chaos. By the end of the day, she flat out refused to bless any more items. No massive public miracle occurred, but Marian told the crowd that the Virgin had exhorted everyone to, quote, pray, pray, pray. She warned, the enemy of God is all over America. Pope Pius XII is in danger unless we pray. I want to warn of Cora. I don't know what she means by that. It won't stop unless we pray. Our bishop must remember my warning of Fatima. Black clouds are coming over America. Alaska is the first stepping stone. Remember the Pacific coast. Remember now. Only prayer will save us. A newspaper report from the day describes Marianne as, quote, at times inaudible, despite a microphone, and at times her talk was rambling. Pilgrims left the Vanhoof farm that day with mixed reactions, not knowing how to feel. Some were underwhelmed that no great Fatima-like miracle had happened, and disappointed that they had taken hours-long bus rides to rural Wisconsin for apparently no reason. Most of the pilgrims interviewed, though, thought it had been worth visiting and were impressed by the unity of the crowd in venerating the Virgin Mary, apparition or not. Of course, there were also those who were deeply moved by Marianne's apocalyptic visions and returned to their homes convinced of her legitimacy. Those who felt Marianne's visions were compelling returned in October, although in much smaller numbers. Around 2,000 people arrived to maintain an all-night vigil, waiting for a new message from the Virgin Mary on the morning of the 7th. On the day itself, the crowd was estimated around 50,000 people, and unlike the apparition in August, this time people actually reported seeing some supernatural activity. One Appleton man who was already involved in the shrine claimed to see the sun whirling around and dancing, which is nearly identical to the miracle of the sun reported at Fatima in 1917. Many others corroborated this, including a priest. The solar phenomenon reportedly happened in multiple short episodes throughout the day as the crowd grew. Journalists, however, saw nothing. The supposed apparitions in August and October of 1950 bring us what into my co-writer Sawyer calls the formative period. From 1950 to around 1975, Maryanne Vanhoof's visions evolved from a fairly typical mid-20th century series of Marian apparitions into a conspiracist, anti-Semitic, apocalyptic, weapons-hoarding cult. There's not a ton of detailed information about what happened year over year, so we will have to speak in general terms. In late November of 1950, the Archbishop of Milwaukee ordered the shrine to be dismantled. As previously noted, the shrine didn't consist of all that much at the time, so it was just the statue of Our Lady of Fatima and the Stations of the Cross that were removed. It's unclear when it was rebuilt, but it seems like they just put it all back up within a few months. The same November, the Virgin Mary imposed the penance she was supposed to give back on October 7th. Why she was late, I don't know. Marianne was to experience the wounds of Christ, also called the stigmata, on the Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays of Advent that year, the month-long period leading up to Christmas. On Fridays, Marianne was confined to her bed and incoherent, convulsing and mumbling. This was repeated in Lent and Advent of 1951, where she claimed to physically feel and manifest the wounds of Jesus' crown of thorns. During Advent, she maintained that she was so ill she couldn't keep food down and went on a liquid diet for nearly a month. She repeated this same formula in successive Lents and Advents, supposedly without issue. The official investigation, which had started in June 1950, continued into 1951 and 52, and the chronological details are kind of fuzzy. Despite some sympathy from individual priests and nuns, including the local parish priest Father Langowski, the church overall took a highly skeptical view of Marianne's claims from the jump, as it generally did with any reported apparition or miracle. In 1952, Bishop Tracy of La Crosse decided to test Marianne's supposedly extreme sufferings during Lent and Advent. He ordered that she be hospitalized at Marquette University Medical School during Holy Week. Tests revealed that she had a normal level of salt in her system, indicating she had consumed solids recently. She insisted she be placed on a diet of only coffee and juice, as she had been doing during the penitential seasons prior. She lost weight and her salt levels dropped, contradicting her claims that she could live on a liquid diet without any complications. She was reportedly seen sneaking food on one occasion from a nurse, and would dramatically feign convulsions as she, quote, suffered the agonies of Calvary. While in the hospital, her head, hands, and arms were bandaged, and all sharp objects were taken away from her. Under these circumstances, no signs of the stigmata manifested. The investigating committee also conducted pretty extensive interviews with Marianne, which is where we get most of the information on her early life from. One of the factors which led to the committee's skepticism of Marianne was her mother's involvement in spiritualism. Marianne's mother, Elizabeth Bieber, was reportedly very enthusiastic about her daughter's visions and took up a prominent role in the apparition carnival early on. She was the one who commissioned a statue of Our Lady of Necedah, based on Marianne's description of what she saw. Marianne wasn't personally very involved with the spiritualists, but a letter to the investigating committee from the Kenosha Assembly said she had participated and shown, quote, psychic susceptibility. Elizabeth's connections to that sphere resulted in lots of mediums and psychics from across the country trying to contact Marianne with various messages about her visions, and claiming that their spirit guides were confirming Marianne's visions. One such woman was Jenny Ferrari, a Chicago mystic whom Father Heighthouse interviewed for the investigation. Ferrari, with only a 5th grade education, claimed to speak Aramaic and ancient Egyptian. Heighthouse is quoted as saying, "How she learned them I have no idea, but we caught her in a number of lies and mistakes about the Vanhoof claims. In fact, the poor woman had no idea what was going on, didn't know which end was up." Marianne also had very little formal education, and for her whole life, most of the messages she relayed from the Virgin Mary had significant grammatical and spelling errors. Her August 15th speech was described by a diocesan spokesman as incoherent, illiterate, and, quote, full of contradictory nonsense. In June of 1955, Bishop Tracy issued a formal condemnation of the claimed apparitions based on the diocesan investigation. Father Heighthouse, head of the investigating committee, explained in the Capital Times that Marianne lied and contradicted herself and Catholic doctrine constantly in her answers, and he noted the aforementioned hospital stay as evidence for deceit. The investigation also produced a psychiatric report, which has never been published, but according to Father Heighthouse, they found that Marianne's seizures were a result of, quote, hysteria and repressed sexual anxiety, and that, quote, she reached a state of neurosis which allowed her to experience a long repressed sexual orgasm. Ah, the 1950s. Misogyny notwithstanding, they came to a decisive conclusion that Marianne's visions were full of baloney. The shrine soldiered on, and soon set up For My God and My Country, Inc., the tax-exempt organization responsible for the shrine's operations. FMG and MC started a printing press and publishing company where they started printing literature for the shrine and began mail campaigns to solicit donations. This was enormously successful and allowed the shrine to expand its operations and build out the shrine itself. In 1955, Henry Swan, again the president of the Necedah Chamber of Commerce and an early apparition supporter, compiled detailed accounts of all of Marianne's apparitions and her supernatural sufferings after being requested to do so the previous year. He also wrote a 4-volume book entitled My Work with Necedah about the early history of the shrine and his contributions to it, published in 1959. The first volume is from Marianne's perspective and provides a comprehensive account of her visions from 1949 to 1955. The remaining 3 volumes are miscellaneous compilations of Marianne's spiritual revelations, Henry Swan's conspiracy theories, and combinations of both. It was also Henry Swan who seems to have been the main force driving the increasingly extreme and conspiratorial bent of the shrine in the 1950s. Swan was deeply paranoid about the, quote, destructive forces of Satan at work in the world. At the top of Satan's chain of command were the Grand Masters and learned elders of Zion. Yeah. Swan's beliefs about there being a cabal of Jewish Zionist elites using Freemasonry and communism to spread their satanic agenda is nearly identical to the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories still propagated today. He thought that American Catholics' ignoring of the Church's condemnation of Freemasonry and lack of respect for Marian apparitions contributed to the power that Satan held over the country. Swan denied that his views were anti-Semitic. His mentality went something like, yes, the forces of Satan are mostly composed of Jews, but that's no reason to blame all Jews. Most Jews in America were upstanding citizens, he said. The bad satanic ones were the ones who had, quote, mongrelized their bloodlines by intermarrying with other Americans. So Henry Swan was a rare bird, someone who believes in standard anti-Semitic conspiracy stuff, but is willing to say hashtag not all Jews. And also, he liked Jews as long as they were racially pure to themselves. Racial purity for everyone, sure, why not? I love it when I come across a guy who is bigoted in outrageous ways, but not on any axis that would make sense to the bigots of today. Pretty common occurrence on Tor's cabinet. By the mid-1950s, Marianne herself was promoting ideas clearly influenced by Swan. In 1957, she claimed that the Grand Master was in the USA, and that he would be having some kind of sinister meeting with the other masters at 6 p.m. at the Waldorf Astoria in New York. In 1960, she said that the Grand Masters had sunk their teeth into America because no one was listening to Pope Leo XIII's encyclicals on Freemasonry. There's no better source of information about the Shrine's berserk ideology in the 1950s than Volume 4 of My Work with Necedah. All the volumes of My Work with Necedah are focused on various prophetic messages and anecdotes from Marianne, interspersed with commentary and notes from Henry Swan. The fourth volume, though, is so conspiratorial in such a bizarre way that it merits particular attention. The book opens with Marianne's narrative of being visited by the spirit of Tsar Alexander III of Russia, who reigned from 1881 to 1894. In real life, Alexander III was known for being very reactionary, theocratic, and anti-Semitic, while also being a peacemaker in foreign policy. Marianne's account of the Alexander III apparition is long and confusing, but the central thesis is that the Tsar was not a tyrant, but in fact a good Christian who did what was best for his country. To this end, Marianne wrote that the international bankers and nihilists were behind the terrible destruction of his beloved country.
Man, they were nihilists, man.
Huh?
They kept saying they believed in nothing.
Alexander III's father, Alexander II, was assassinated by Yiddish nihilists in the same way Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, quote, because he wanted to coin his own money to get away from the clutches of Engländer, des Haus für die International Bankerers. Much of the content of the book is familiar anti-Semitism, a la Protocols of the Elders of Zion. One particular focus is on Benjamin Disraeli, the 19th century Prime Minister of the UK. Alexander III told Marianne that Disraeli was a Yiddish nihilist who sought to destroy Russia because it was, quote, undoubtedly the most Christian and Catholic of all the European nations. Note that Russia is not Catholic, it is Orthodox, it has never been Catholic at all, and in times past persecuted Catholics. Of course, Marianne also discusses the satanic Rothschilds and their servants Metternich, Napoleon, Britain, Protestants, Freemasons, the Mexicans, and the Confederates in a brief pseudo-history of 19th century America. After that aside, she returns to Alexander III. Quote, on June 10, 1956, Alexander III appeared to Marianne again and said he had received a message from the secret police which caused his death on October 20th, 1894. The message said the nihilists were holding off until his death and then they would rule as before. Alexander said that the nihilists were not Bolshevists, as many believed. Marianne asked him what it was, and he used a strange word which sounded like Judaism, and finally when she got to understand him, it was Judaism Masonry, of which the English Disraeli was now the head. Alexander died of a broken heart, albeit induced by poison. Quote, the secret apostles of revolution, the nihilists, the underground advocates of reform, are directly responsible for the death of Alexander III, as they were for the death of his father, Alexander II. The hidden hand up to this time had to their credit the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, 6 Romanovs, 10 kings, and scores of ministers. This is all in the first 20 pages for the record. The books published by the Necedah Shrine could each be their own episode, but I'll just give some highlights from the rest of Volume 4. Much of the book is out-of-context revelations about politics, the space race, spy rings, the USSR, the impending World War III, and so on from Marianne, seemingly based on visits, not from Mary, but from Alexander III. In Chapter 2, Alexander III gives a warning about the invasion of undesirable immigrants, including thousands of anti-Christian Jews and Judeo-Mongols, Yids, disguising themselves as other nationalities. Other chapters include one where the then leader of Ireland, Eamon de Valera, is accused of being an Irish Disraeli, a list of subversives, a chapter titled Criticize the Freaks, another about how the agents of Satan are trying to start a race war, yet another where the colors of the Aurora Borealis are omens of God's anger, one which outlines the details of Satan's great chain of command, one about the Fraulein, a supposed spy for the evil forces who infiltrated the US, another about spy reports and subversive activities, another about radioactivity and testing fallout, one called Shanghaiing, another which praises Spanish dictator Francisco Franco as true to God but under pressure from the forces of evil, and finally a very long chapter entirely about the activities of Russian submarines and jet planes. Henry Swan died in 1960, not long after my work with Necedah was published. His ideological influence, though, seems to have stayed with the shrine. In the 1970s, my work with Necedah would be reprinted, along with new compilations of Maryanne's divine revelations. Revelations and Messages, as given through Maryanne Vanhoof, published in 1970, is, it seems, the origin of the 8 points. They still promote and sell copies of all of these books in their shop today. Ray Pritzl, president of FMGMC and Maryanne's right-hand man, encouraged everything about this, down to the last rant. Pritzl was known as acting as Maryanne's armed bodyguard and, quote, hatchet man, protecting her from journalists, church officials, and communists, whom he claimed were trying to assassinate her. He was responsible for affiliating the shrine with the, quote, Youth Group of Covington, Kentucky, an organization that neither Sawyer nor I could find any information about. According to the Capital Times, it was an offshoot of the John Birch Society. If you're familiar with Cold War ultra-conservative conspiracism, you probably could have seen that connection coming. It was also around this time when they started getting weird about patriotism, if they weren't already. It's impossible to ignore the particularly bizarre synthesis of American nationalist mythology and Catholic apocalypticism which pervades the Necedah Shrine. One of Maryanne's more idiosyncratic claims was that the Virgin Mary appeared to George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, which is found in yet another chapter of my work with Necedah, Volume 4. The Madonna Maria warned George Washington that the U.S. would withstand 5 sieges: the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, World War I and II, then a long period of corruption and sin, and finally, the final and worst siege, where the whole world would flow with blood. Quote, man-powered flying machines would destroy the world from the sky in a global war. Mary also warned Washington of future race wars in the U.S., where white Christians would be fighting against black and yellow races backed by evil forces. Maryanne said the final phase was imminent, but that Mary would protect America, as she had previously, and only those who followed the law of God would be saved from turmoil. Maryanne's health continued to decline. From 1955, she used a wheelchair at all times. She suffered from insomnia, nausea, chronic pain, and a dropsy-like condition. She spent most of her time reading books and magazines, and periodically dispensing new messages from the Virgin Mary and, I guess, Alexander III. These health problems and eremitic seclusion only furthered her followers' perception of her as a victim soul and a prophet, suffering on behalf of a sinful world. In 1959, the Vanhoof farmhouse burned to the ground. There's no evidence that it was anything other than an accident. It had been a decrepit tiny house with no running water, but it was the headquarters of the Necedah cult. This incident resulted in a period of a few years where it seems not much happened. They were at a bit of a low point, having been humiliated by the bishop's condemnation and now having to find somewhere for the perpetually ailing Maryanne to live. Then, in 1960, Godfred Vanhoof died. He was the first person buried in the shrine's cemetery. Then, they began to attract other pseudo-Catholic weirdos. Inexplicably, in October of 1963, a man calling himself Pope Clement XV arrived in Necedah with a small group of followers, mostly from Alberta and Quebec, calling themselves the Apostle Servants of the Infinite Love and the Magnificat. They purchased an old mansion, which had previously been a convent for nuns, and established the, quote, Infinite Love domain. This group, the Apostles of Infinite Love, would later become one of Canada's most infamous cults, but in 1963 it seems like it was just a small band of weirdos. Necedah locals were nonchalant and didn't seem particularly interested in whatever an infinite love domain is. Pope Clement XV's real name was Michel Collin. He was a defrocked priest from France who had previously served time for fraud. He didn't speak any English, so one of his followers acted as an interpreter. He claimed Christ had come to him in a vision and secretly consecrated him pope in 1950, but he was not ordered to go public until 1961. Unusually for a pope, he had a wife, who called herself a nun. The Green Bay Press-Gazette reported that the Apostles of Infinite Love had purchased the sacred spot at the Necedah Shrine, but Sawyer thinks this is more likely a rumor. There's photographic evidence of the group holding some sort of ceremony just outside of the shrine, but actually purchasing the land would seem unlikely. The Press-Gazette also said that the Vanhoof cult had died out after the original farmhouse burned down in 1959, which is false. The Divine Love people believed in the Necedah apparitions and obviously wanted to associate themselves with them, but actual shrine-goers denied any connection. It's unclear what happened with this group after they showed up in Necedah in October 1963, but by June of 1964 they had skipped town. For the rest of the 1960s, they seem to have been based in Montreal and France. They showed up in Italy in 1969, where some of them were arrested for insulting the real Pope. By 1965, the shrine seems to have found its footing again. Around 1,500 people visited for the annual Assumption Festival and were greeted by a replica of the original farmhouse and several new glass shrines. On October 7th of 1968, over 5,000 pilgrims visited, with 15 chartered buses from as far away as California. In 1971, the Diocese of La Crosse condemned the shrine once again, as a fresh investigation started in 1969. In 1972, Bishop Tracy visited the shrine and then decreed that they halt essentially all activity and prohibited all private and public worship relating to the shrine. Obviously, they didn't listen. The formative period is also where we see the building of the Shrine Belt. This started as early as 1950, but really took off in the 60s and 70s. The Shrine Belt is an area surrounding the shrine east of Necedah proper that was bought up by For My God and My Country, Inc., and developed into a rural, pine tree-lined, picturesque neighborhood to attract apparition believers from all over the country. By 1970, the cult owned over 130 acres. The Shrine Belt is still obvious today, with street names like Shrine Road, Queensway, St. Anne's Street, St. Joseph Street, and Trinity Street. Over 300 people moved to the Shrine Belt, and still others purchased or built vacation homes in the area. They also started hoarding weapons. Like, a lot of weapons. There's not much detailed information about their weapons cache, but as we arrive back at the start of this video, it must be mentioned that when cops investigated the aftermath of the 1974 shootout, one of them described it as nothing short of an arsenal. Val Binkowski himself had dozens of shotguns, rifles, and pistols, as well as thousands of rounds of ammunition, and that's after his brother Henry held off the cops for 6 hours straight using Val's own prepper arsenal in an attempt to kill him. It's astonishing how little of an impact that incident seems to have had. It was not covered in any newspapers until the 1980 Capital Times investigation, and rarely mentioned even afterwards. Sawyer, the primary writer of this episode, visited the shrine in 2022, a normal hangout spot for a 17-year-old on summer vacation. They first discovered the Necedah Shrine while rummaging through the old newspaper archives of the Madison Public Library for a different project, and were immediately fascinated for reasons hopefully obvious by now. That thin manila folder of newspaper clippings about the shrine sent them down the rabbit hole. That summer, Sawyer and their mom stopped at the shrine while driving from Rhinelander to Madison. It's only about an hour out of the way. Necedah itself is not that weird. It's a pretty standard rural Wisconsin town, but the shrine compound is downright surreal. The first thing one sees is the shrine cemetery, where Marian and many other characters in this story are buried. Driving a little further, you arrive at the shrine itself. You're greeted by a bunch of large vintage-style blue signs, forcefully informing you of the modesty requirements and that there are shawls available for those wearing shorts and tank tops. The central feature of the complex is the House of Prayer, a massive unfinished cinder block structure vaguely shaped like a heart. Surrounding the House of Prayer are 14 smaller standalone shrines consisting of creepy painted plaster statues in glass buildings. There are depictions of the Last Supper, Jesus carrying the cross, Jesus as a child with Mary and Joseph, a very bloody crucifixion, and a number of saints, including St. Anne, Joan of Arc, Michael the Archangel, and Francis Xavier Cabrini, all of whom Marian claimed to have been visited by. At the original apparition spot, there's a granite plaque and a statue of the Virgin Mary, designed as she supposedly appeared to Marianne. There's also a replica of the Vanhoof farmhouse, which was destroyed by fire in 1959. Sawyer's favorite attraction, though, is the My God and Country Shrine, which has Abe Lincoln and George Washington flanking Jesus, who is wearing a crown and standing on a globe. If you'd like to buy a souvenir, they, of course, have a gift shop, outfitted with a scale model of the design for the House of Prayer, a huge number of rosaries, holy pictures, saint medals, literature, and other bits and bobs, and a lot of graphic photos of aborted fetuses for decoration. They even sell their own in-house medal, which they call the Unity Medal, featuring the shrine's unique Mary image. Up to now, most of our information has come from scholarly articles and books. A number of academics have taken interest in Maryanne Vanhoof as a case study for the Cold War politicization of Marian devotion, but haven't really dug into the shrine's history beyond the mid-1970s. Somehow, things get even weirder from this point on. Sawyer dug up this information from dozens and dozens of contemporary local news clippings and has tried to put together a coherent narrative. This video is certainly the most comprehensive history of the Necedah Shrine available anywhere. Back to the story. 1975 saw the long-simmering conflict between the shrine and the Catholic Church boil up. On March 2nd, the new Bishop Freaking placed Marian and 6 of her most loyal followers under interdict, one of the harshest sanctions available short of full excommunication, meaning they could not receive any of the sacraments except for confession. Later that year, in August, Father James Barney of St. Francis Church started refusing communion to all of the parishioners who wouldn't renounce the shrine. In November, Father Barney asked the Vanhoofers to stop attending Mass at St. Francis full stop. He stationed himself outside the church to prevent Vanhoofers from coming in. Kicking out shrine adherents reduced the size of the parish by almost half. Bishop Freaking publicly agreed with Father Barney's decision. One shrine adherent told reporters this was a great victory for the shrine, since they now had a reason to build their own church. Vanhoofers, including those under interdict, started attending Mass at churches in other towns to avoid detection. Despite the repeated condemnations by the church, the shrine continued attracting thousands of pilgrims on apparition days, especially the Feast of the Assumption. In 1976, the shrine participated in Necedah's American bicentennial celebrations, providing at least 3 floats in the local parade. In 1977, they started construction on the House of Prayer, after many years of vague planning. Marianne said that St. Anne, the mother of Virgin Mary, had recently told her to start construction as soon as possible. One leader of the shrine said that the House of Prayer would indeed be a proper church, able to celebrate Mass, but when asked where they would get priests, he said, "We'll cross that bridge when we come to it." At this point, the Shriners still somehow believed that the Catholic Church would eventually recognize the Necedah apparitions. Around this time in the mid-1970s, the Church itself was seeing a period of innovation. In 1976, Pope Paul VI promulgated a new form of the Mass, the Novus Ordo, which was significantly overhauled and almost entirely used vernacular language instead of Latin. This was on the heels of Vatican II, a series of conferences held in the Vatican from 1962 to 65 that resulted in major changes to the Catholic Church's practices and outlook to reach modern audiences. The Novus Ordo is still the standard form of Mass used in the vast majority of Catholic churches worldwide today, but it wasn't without opposition. In fact, the changes made to the Mass in the 1960s and 70s would become a key flashpoint for traditionalist Catholicism. Sawyer couldn't find any specific information about the Shrine's reaction to the Novus Ordo at the time, but based on everything else, it was probably not positive. When Pope Paul VI died in 1978, it became clear that the Shrine was flirting with full schism. On August 15th, with thousands in attendance once again, one speaker at the annual ceremony declared that a wrong pope, the evil pope, a liberal pope, could succeed Paul VI if the laity did not sufficiently pray. He asked the pilgrims to storm heaven with prayer, sacrifice, self-denial, and penance so that this conclave of bishops would elect a valid pope. The idea that a conclave could elect an invalid pope points to a sedevacantist leaning. Sedevacantism, literally vacant seat-ism, is when traditionalist Catholics ask, "Is the Pope Catholic?" and conclude that the answer is no. More formally, it's the idea that the papacy is vacant and that the current pope is illegitimate. Most often, sedevacantists believe that every pope after Pius XII, that is, every pope from Vatican II onwards, has been an anti-pope, but there's a lot of variation. 1979 would prove to be a watershed year for the Necedah Shrine. At the annual Memorial Day ceremonies, a Milwaukee man named Edward Stalick, calling himself the Archbishop and Metropolitan of North America of the American Catholic Church, Roman Catholic Ultrajectine, blessed the shrine and proclaimed a new affiliation with the Old Catholic Church. Old Catholic Church is a term used mainly to refer to those who split with the Roman Catholic Church in the 18th and 19th centuries over various political and theological disagreements, especially papal infallibility, and who later coalesced in their own denominations. In this case, it seems like Stalick belonged to the Old Catholic Church of America, but there were quite a few different, small and poorly documented independent Catholic denominations floating around the US at the time. For the preceding few weeks, shrine devotees had been told to expect a visit from the Archbishop of Milwaukee, which they took to mean the actual Archbishop of Milwaukee, Rembert Weekland, not some random guy from Milwaukee. Both the Diocese of La Crosse and the Archdiocese of Milwaukee, of course, clarified that they had no clue who Edward Stalick was. So, who was Edward Stalick? He said that he had first visited Necedah on Good Friday that year, where he had witnessed Marianne having an ecstatic vision of the Passion of Christ, not the movie, and the Celestials, saints who Marianne claimed regularly visited her, gave a message declaring him to be a worthy bishop for the shrine. Stalick was from Milwaukee and had an office and a couple of followers there. He claimed he and his order of 7 religious brothers and 6 priests had attended seminary in Milwaukee. One man known as Brother Glenn, a follower of Stalick, said that they were not in fact affiliated with the Old Catholic Church and called them wackos. According to Brother Glenn, they were true-believing Roman Catholics, who simply rejected all the changes made to the church since 1564. He claimed that they had requested and been refused papal recognition, and were still trying. Personally, Stalick claimed that he had spent 2 years studying at St. Naciance's Seminary in Wisconsin and another 4 years at a Discalced Carmelite monastery, and that he was ordained by the Old Catholic Bishop of Milwaukee, Walter Brown. He also claimed to have a degree in chemistry from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. In reality, during the period he claimed to have been in seminary and at the monastery, he was married to his first wife and living in Milwaukee. He also did not have a degree in chemistry and had dropped out as a sophomore. In 1977, he had listed himself as a clergyman at St. Paul's Episcopal Church in the Watertown, Wisconsin City Directory. When contacted, the clergy there had never heard of him. When asked about Stalick, Old Catholic Bishop Walter Brown confirmed that he had indeed been ordained by the Old Catholic Church, but was excommunicated for not only being married twice, but for, quote, devil worship and unchristlike behavior at Mass. Put a pin in this for now. We'll follow up with his story later. Another one of Stalick's followers who came with him to Necedah was David Javor. Father David, as he was known, was another Milwaukee man who claimed that he had left a previous seminary and became a Palatine brother. He was actually dismissed from the cemetery and had only taken temporary vows with the Palatine order. When contacted, the order said that they would not have allowed him to take permanent vows anyways because of his donations going missing. In 1978, he was running a home for intellectually disabled adults and was accused by a colleague of misusing over $6,000 in Social Security funds for his home and being incredibly physically abusive to one of the disabled men living there. So, who ordained this nutjob? Well, he claimed to have been ordained by the Church of Gospel Ministry, an organization that will ordain anyone for $15. Like his boss, he was also ordained by the Old Catholic Church and later excommunicated. The aforementioned Brother Glenn, too, followed Stalick to Necedah. Glenn Gergen first became known locally in Milwaukee for the fundamentalist rants he'd tape and distribute to radio stations in the area for late-night broadcasts. He claimed he'd been a religious brother since 1967, but during that time he had been married and divorced twice, lost a paternity suit, and attempted to kidnap the child from their mother, was arrested for transporting drugs, beat up a 16-year-old, operated a phony dance contest, whatever that means, and pulled a stunt where he set up a telephone sales campaign and then announced that he'd made everyone in the phone room a religious brother. For some reason, on Channel 12 TV, he told the cameras openly that he had taken nude photos of multiple teenage girls, quote, maybe 2 years ago. In his defense, he said he was involved in a lot of drugs at the time. On February 15th, 1980, State Senator Michelle Radicevich formally asked for a state investigation of the shrine-run 7 Sorrows of Our Sorrowful Mother's Infants Home, known to non-Vancouver locals as the Baby Farm. A few days earlier, the Capital Times had published an exposé of the organization, which revealed, quote, numerous shocking instances of questionable medical practices that had happened at the home. The 7 Sorrows Infant Home was established in 1973 and ostensibly offered shelter to unwed mothers and their babies as an alternative to abortion. Women and teenage girls from all over the country were sent there. As with everything else, it was built on the supposed orders of the Virgin Mary. It was operated mainly by inadequately trained quote-unquote nuns and had little in the way of medical equipment. The only doctor was Peter O'Loughlin, one of the shrine's 33 chosen ones and a member of the board of directors, but he had no gynecological expertise. In 1976, an 8-month-old baby was brought to the Watertown Memorial Hospital nearby with severe eczema that had been treated with chiropractic. The doctor treating the child brought his concerns to the hospital, and they brought a child abuse claim against the home, but nothing came of it. Earlier that year, a baby had been born prematurely in a Necedah home and taken to the infant's home where there was no medical equipment. The baby died shortly after. In another case, one woman said that O'Loughlin had instructed her to douche with dish soap during her pregnancy. In yet another instance, he accidentally cut off the tip of an infant's penis during what was supposed to be a regular circumcision. No official action was taken against the infant's home despite these incidents because there simply was no existing regulation for institutions like these. The Seven Sorrows Infants Home was unique in the state of Wisconsin. Another issue the Capital Times investigation revealed was the home's coercion of mothers to give up their children. Unsurprisingly, no psychological or counseling services were provided at the home, and women were made to pay hundreds of dollars to keep their children. Giving them up was, of course, free. Adoptive parents of children at the home were usually cult members, but if they weren't, they had to be 21 to 45 years old, not previously divorced, married for at least 3 years, the mother must not be working, and at least one parent must be a practicing Roman Catholic. The irony, of course, is that none of the shrine members were allowed to receive the sacraments at this point. None of them were practicing Roman Catholics. When asked about the home's operation, Thomas McNally, the unofficial legal spokesperson and counsel for the shrine and another one of the 33 chosen ones, refused to say anything about O'Loughlin's medical practices, how many babies were being born at the home's finances, or its conspicuous lack of record-keeping. The day after Senator Radisevich called for a probe of the infant's home, Governor Lee Dreyfus joined her. Pressure was mounting. A spokesman for the governor called the home a horror story. State Senator Thomas Harnich, who represented the district in which Necedah is located, promised he would sponsor legislation that would allow the state to regulate the home. This political pressure would ultimately come to naught, though. A law passed by the most recent legislature prevented the Department of Health and Social Services from accessing the requisite medical records to perform an investigation. The issue seems to have just fizzled out after this. In May of 1980, only a few months later, another one of Edward Stalick's disciples came to public attention. David Edward Schott, a, quote, auxiliary archbishop at the shrine, was arrested for violating his probation conditions in Maryland, where he'd been previously convicted of sexually assaulting an 11-year-old boy. He was released on a $1,500 bond, back to the shrine's inner circle, who refused to turn him in when Maryland sheriff's deputies came looking for him shortly thereafter. A Juneau County court decided Schott could remain out on bail as long as he didn't leave the county and authorities were kept updated on his whereabouts. In reality, of course, only Thomas McNally, the aforementioned unofficial legal counsel for the shrine, knew where he was at any given time. In June, he was again behind bars, facing extradition to Maryland. Schott had skipped Maryland probation in April by going down to Florida to work as an orange picker. How he got to Milwaukee and then Necedah only a month later, I don't know. When he came to Necedah, he was in the company of a young boy he claimed legal guardianship over, but never produced any papers to prove that. According to one article, Schott, quote, flaunted his pedophilia and bragged about carrying a pistol on him at all times. While facing extradition to Maryland, he was held at the Mendota State Mental Hospital in Madison, coincidentally the same place Ed Gein was imprisoned at the time. Schott escaped, probably with the help of other cult members, and was never captured. It's unknown what happened to him. On one Sunday, in January of 1981, shrinegoers attending Sunday Mass were surprised with the news that their charismatic Archbishop, Edward Stalick, had abandoned them. At each Mass, a letter was read out, in which Stalick said that he had gotten married and rejoined the mainstream Catholic Church. He called Marianne a complete and total fraud and a cult leader. After reading out the letter, the congregation were told this was an example of how even clergymen could be bought by the devil. Edward Stalick disappeared as suddenly as he had appeared 2 years earlier. In 1985, Capital Times reporter Rob Fixmer received a mysterious phone call from, quote, a concerned person in Mauston. The only message for him was, Edward Stalick is dead. Rob Fixmer was probably the singular expert on the Necedah Shrine in the 1970s and 80s. His investigative journalism into the Shrineanigans is where much of this episode comes from. For whatever reason, starting in 1982, Ed Stalick would call him from time to time. As Fixmer puts it, quote, Stalick would call me out of the blue, at first to straighten me out, but eventually to simply expound on his life, his dealings with the Vanhoof cult in Necedah, and the Old Catholics. As it turns out, Stalick had gone to West Covina, a suburb of Los Angeles, and was working as a chemical salesman. In their phone calls, he told Fixmer salacious details about who had excommunicated who in the Old Catholic Church, previously unknown details about Necedah scandals, and wild tales about, quote, homosexual rituals he had done with other Old Catholic bishops. Yes, Stalick was gay. I didn't mention it earlier because it wasn't immediately relevant to the Necedah Shrine, but he was definitely into men. He sometimes flaunted it and sometimes denied it. At one time, he wrote that his, quote, leaning towards homosexuality began at the end of his first marriage, while another time, he told Fixmer he had known since high school. When asked about his excommunication by the Old Catholic bishop, Stalick told Fixmer he was lying. I excommunicated Bishop Brown. But that's a long story. Whatever that means, Stalick loved to tell Fixmer about the juicy details of his time in Necedah. In fact, he told him that he had first heard about the shrine from a 1975 article that Fixmer had written, and ironically, was inspired to join because of it. He never seemed to actually like any of the weirdo cronies who followed him from Milwaukee, though, and turned on them as soon as they threatened his position. In 1980, Marianne had decided David Schott would be Stalick's successor without consulting him. When he found out about this, Stalick tipped off the Maryland cops as to Schott's location. Glenn Gergen was still running radio scams when he was a brother, and was trying to get the Necedah Shrine to funnel money into it. Stalick opposed this, and Gergen tried to blackmail him. He had tapped Stalick's phone and recorded not only evidence of an ongoing affair with an old Catholic bishop, but, quote, typical homosexual remarks about shrine parishioners and the size of their penises. Gergen showed these to the shrine lawyer Tom McNally and threatened to out him publicly, but Stalick's response was, so what? This somehow worked, and Stalick simply excommunicated Gergen. This did take a toll on him, though, and he later told Fixmer that he had emotionally collapsed in 1981, causing him to abandon the shrine. His retrospective amusement with the sheer absurdity of his life, expressed via those out-of-the-blue phone calls to Rob Fixmer, only came after he left for California, where he could be openly gay and start over. So, when Fixmer got that call at 5 a.m. in 1985, it wasn't unreasonable that he assumed it was Stalick. What he was not expecting was the anonymous caller's ominous declaration that Stalick was dead. The, quote, concerned citizen from Boston told Fixmer that Stalick had been murdered in his California home, found lying in a pool of blood with his house ransacked. David Javor, one of Stalick's former cronies in Milwaukee and Necedah, confirmed he was dead, as did the Old Catholic Diocese of Milwaukee. Neither knew the circumstances. Stalick's phone number was also disconnected. But when Fixmer contacted the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office, he found that no one named Edward Stalick had died there. He hadn't been living at the house in West Covina either. There's a gravestone for him at a cemetery in West Bend, Wisconsin, which matches the story that he was murdered in 1985. Find a Grave says he died in Orange County, which contradicts him being killed in West Covina, which is in neighboring Los Angeles County, but I don't know where the person who added that information got it from. It's possible he was using a fake name while he was in California, but Sawyer couldn't find any news reports of murders happening in Los Angeles or Orange County which matched the description and timeline of Stalick's supposed death. What happened to Ed Stalick, the enigmatic Archbishop of Necedah? If Stalick was indeed murdered in 1985, he was 41 years old. What a life to live in just 41 years. He had a daughter with his second wife, born in 1975. I wonder where she is. If Stalick is still alive today, which is possible, he'd be 81. He might have faked his death. That would hardly be the weirdest thing he'd ever did. We'll probably never know what truly happened to him. In Rob Fixmer's words, quote, on whichever side of eternity Edward Michael Stalick finds himself this day, I assume he is amused as always by the foibles of mortals in search of their creator. We're back in the early 80s. Throughout the previous decades, the Shrine had slowly consolidated their political power. In 1980, Juneau County elections were often decided by as few as 1,200 votes. The Necedah Shrine controlled 500 of those votes by distributing suggested voting lists. Obviously, no Juneau County politician wanted to mess with the Shrine. They'd never be elected again. Likewise, and I buried the lead on this earlier, the district attorney's court reporter admitted to the Capital Times that he had destroyed the records relating to the deaths of Henry Benkowski and Tommy Huber on that fateful day in 1974. And when investigators contacted Adams County Memorial Hospital about the Seven Sorrows Infants Home, they refused to say anything. Shrine followers made up half of their patients. Few officials ever admitted that the shrine had such tight control of local politics, as that would of course implicate them, but everyone in central Wisconsin knew about this state of affairs. One local man is quoted as saying, "I'd be surprised to find out the shrine ever actually bribed anybody. With all the power they have, they don't have to buy off anybody. It's enough for one of the inner circle to just suggest it would be nice if." In August 1981, a recall petition began circulating in central Wisconsin, attempting to oust the aforementioned state senator, Thomas Harnisch. Harnisch was a prominent environmentalist in Wisconsin politics, and is known for authoring the Wisconsin Farmland Preservation Act, creating the Inland Waters Trout Stamp Program, and being the architect of the Wisconsin Conservation Corps, a program modeled after FDR's Civilian Conservation Corps. In all, he's a pretty cool guy. He's still alive. At this time, Harnisch was chairman of the Senate Agricultural and Natural Resources Committee and was trying to push through a provision in the state budget that would strengthen soil conservation efforts. In order to advance the recall, the petitioners would need to gather 11,862 signatures within 60 days. The petition would then be submitted to the Elections Board, certified, and a special election would be held. The highly organized recall campaign presented themselves as a grassroots movement led by honest, red-blooded Americans. The public face of the campaign was David Volovsek, a local logger who claimed the reason for the recall was general discontentment among the rural farmers of the area, and that Harnisch's environmentalist infringement on their property rights was the last straw. From the jump, Harnisch was publicly suspicious of this. Conservative organizations in Wisconsin had been working against him for some time, and he believed that this folksy rural aesthetic was a front for more sinister actors elsewhere in the state. Surprisingly, he was totally right. In late September, the Chippewa Herald-Telegram of Chippewa Falls, a small town in Harnisch's district, best known for being the canonical home of Jack Dawson from Titanic, published an investigation into the real drivers in the recall car. The Herald-Telegram confirmed Harnisch's suspicions that far-right extremist groups were behind the recall, namely the Posse Comitatus, Power of the Country, and an outfit called the Wisconsin Legislative and Research Committee. The Posse Comitatus was a right-wing conspiracist, proto-sovereign citizen organization which made national news earlier in 1981 because of the sheer intensity of their weapons stockpiling and their advocacy for tax revolt. The Posse was first organized in Portland, Oregon, and claimed to have cells in 49 states, but really established itself in rural northern Wisconsin. Their main enemies were Jews and agents of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, and in the early 1980s they were in constant and often violent conflict with local authorities in Wisconsin. They seem to kind of still exist. I've seen Posse Comitatus flags in eastern Oregon. The Wisconsin Legislative and Research Committee, meanwhile, was the project of Virginia Mavis, a Brookfield physician's wife who spent her days propagating every conspiracy theory under the sun via her weekly tabloid, Wisconsin Report. She also had a hobby of attempting to oust her political opponents, having previously tried to recall Governor Patrick Lucey and nearly succeeding at kicking Grant County Board Chairman Richard Marcus to the curb. Notably, one of the WLRC's previous vice presidents was a known leader of the Posse Comitatus. Mavis vociferously denied that she had anything to do with the posse or that she was meddling in the recall. However, David Volovsek himself said that he had asked her for help in putting the petition together, and many of the petitioners were known members of the WLRC. The third group, the Herald-Telegram identified as being behind the recall campaign, was the Necedah Shrine. James Delp, one of the more prominent faces of the recall campaign, publicly identified as a fellow traveler of the shrine. He also happened to have been raised by Dr. O'Laughlin, the leader of the infants' home. An anonymous source told the Herald-Telegram that the connections between the shrine's inner circle and Mavis went deeper, with the shrine handing out Mavis's literature and Mavis making visits up to Necedah. Mavis had common enemies with the shrine, such as Bishop Freaking of La Crosse, the same guy who had placed Marianne and her followers under interdict 6 years prior. Mavis called Bishop Freaking a communist because of his environmentalist bent. Freaking indirectly responded by condemning the recall campaign as an attempt to, quote, intimidate, browbeat, and discourage public officials, and he reaffirmed his support for conservation efforts. The recall petition steadily gained signatures, scandals notwithstanding. By the time the deadline arrived, they told the press they had acquired over 1,200 more signatures than had been required. The petitioners were ostensibly victorious in having taken down Harnish. However, they didn't have it in the bag just yet. Now there was going to be a special election. Some Wisconsin Rapids residents told Harnish's office and the press they had been told to sign the petition, quote, to support the farmers, and nothing about Harnish or a recall. Others reported seeing children circulating the petition, which is very illegal. Nevertheless, on October 8th, the recall campaign submitted their petition to the Elections Board. Note that at this point, Governor Dreyfus, who was a Republican, and GOP National Committee member Odie Fish, which is a great name, were both publicly in support of environmentalist Democrat Harnish's efforts to fight off the far right. They even floated the idea of campaigning on his behalf if a special election had to be held. Could you imagine this happening today? Harnish, although dejected, said he planned to challenge many of the signatures. On October 12th, a judge issued an injunction delaying the Elections Board from certifying the petition so that invalid signatures could be properly investigated. The board ended up disqualifying enough of the signatures to bring the petition back down below the required number. The recall was dead. The petitioners filed a lawsuit to challenge the board's decision and asked the Wisconsin Supreme Court to hear their case. On December 1st, the Supreme Court declined due to, quote, numerous unresolved factual issues. The petitioners brought it up in the Clark County Circuit Court. While that was held up in litigation, they launched a new recall petition. In January of 1982, Harnish announced he would not be seeking re-election next year. In March, Harnish's soil conservation bill, which had caused all of this, was passed unanimously in the state Senate and later signed by Governor Dreyfus. The second petition failed to reach the required signatures by the deadline, and this time, the petitioners gave up. Victory for the anti-soil erosion jihad, as the Capital Times amusingly called it. Aside from their general proclivity for far-right conspiracism and power-grabbing, Sawyer is pretty convinced that the Necedah Shrine got involved in the recall affair because, as you may remember, Harnish was the one who promised to pass legislation which would have regulated the Seven Sorrows Infants Home. After Stalick skipped town in 1981, another one of his disciples became the Bishop of Necedah. Francis de Benedetto, a former Pennsylvania coal miner, was named the new leader by Marianne. During his time, he attempted to establish connections with other schismatic groups when the Old Catholics refused, but was unsuccessful for unclear reasons. Once in power, he and Marianne began to chafe against each other over religious authority and his salary. On Palm Sunday of 1983, those trying to go to Mass at the shrine were turned away by de Benedetto. He announced that he had been excommunicated by a cardinal in Rome. It's unclear what that means, and there was no confirmation that he had actually been excommunicated. He also said he was going to try to reconcile with the mainstream Catholic Church. Spring of 1983 seems to have cracked the cult along existing fault lines. In late May, de Benedetto announced to a crowd of 600 people in the shrine's meeting hall that nothing valid existed here. He had come to the conclusion that Marianne was a manipulative fraud and told the audience they were living a lie. The room sat in stunned silence as he spoke for over an hour. Within a couple of months, hundreds of members left and returned to the mainstream church, including Marianne's daughter Donna Vanhoof. In response, Father Barney of St. Francis Parish and other priests in nearby towns published guidelines for those seeking reconciliation. De Benedetto's departure meant that the shrine no longer had any priests or bishops, fake or real. They were forced to close the seminary, convent, and parochial school they operated as a result. De Benedetto believed that the cult wouldn't survive the split. In an interview in July, he stated that although he had stopped truly believing at the same time as Stalick, he had stayed in Necedah because he felt he needed to do something. Quote, "It had to be someone they knew and trusted, someone who had lived among the people here and who had gotten to know Marianne very well. They wouldn't have listened to anyone else. That's why I stayed." He seemed to have been planning this for a long time. On March 18, 1984, Maryanne Vanhoof died, at the age of 72. You may have noticed how Marianne seemed to have retreated into the shadows of this video, and you'd be right. She had always been sickly, and over the years had become more and more reclusive. In her later years, she almost never made any kind of public appearances and refused to be photographed. She paid little attention to the shenanigans that her most loyal followers got up to. The financial and political activities of the shrine were near entirely controlled by the shrine's lawyer, Thomas McNally, and Dr. Peter O'Loughlin. Unlike many cult leaders, Marianne never really enriched herself. The shrine pulled in millions of dollars in donations over the years, but the Vanhoofs continued living in their small farmhouse and selling eggs. All of that money seems to have really gone to their bizarre projects. Marianne left behind her husband Ray Hurd, who she'd married in 1978. Sawyer couldn't find much information about him, and 6 children. Her son Richard told the paper that her followers would continue. Nothing is going to be stopped. The De Benedetto catastrophe and Marianne's death may not have killed the shrine, but things were never the same. By 1987, only 2 of Marianne's 6 living children were still involved, aforementioned Richard and Kenneth. Donna Vanhoof told the La Crosse Tribune that she still spoke with her siblings, but they weren't as close. She believed that satanic forces were at work, deceiving the shrine's followers. Marianne's husband, Ray Hurd, wasn't even active in the shrine's activities anymore. He had mostly left back in the early 80s because, quote, they aren't doing what I want them to do. He didn't elaborate on what he wanted them to do. And despite being one of the more loyal members even by then, Richard likewise admitted there had been problems and regretted involvement with the old Catholics. They were still having problems with psychics, including someone known as the Little Pebble, originally from Australia and supposedly living in Necedah, who had claimed that Marianne gave them messages from beyond the grave. The Little Pebble was reportedly connected in some ways to a character called Father X, who we'll discuss in a little bit. Told you this gets even weirder. No, it's not over. Even though Donna Vanhoof completely discounted the merit of her mother's visions, she contended that Marianne was always sincere. Assessments of Maryanne Vanhoof range wildly, from her most loyal followers' view of her as a living prophet to Father Heithause's opinion that she was nothing more than a manipulative con artist. The reality is probably more complicated. In Sawyer's opinion, and mine as well, Marianne probably believed that she was telling the truth, at least at the start. Her early accounts of the apparitions are remarkably detailed and emotional, to an unusual extent even for Marian visionaries. She had such severe health problems for so long that it's not crazy to think she may have had spiritual visions or hallucinations that felt really, really real. It also seems likely, though, that her power and status got to her head. I can imagine that for someone who went through as much hardship as she did in the first half of her life, having a posse of loyal followers who believe you can talk directly to the Mother of God and the whole host of heaven would be intoxicating. In that situation, who wouldn't be tempted to keep it going as long as possible? Also, I couldn't find a spot to put this information, but one of the articles about L'Affaire di Benedetto adds this bizarre little detail. Also, De Benedetto last year charged that a group of Vanhoof's followers, including her son Michael, were engaging in witchcraft and black magic by marketing a cure-all electric pillow. Sawyer could not find any other information about what happened there. After this, Necedah was mostly out of the news for a few years. However, in May 1987, a man named Gary McLaughlin was federally indicted in North Dakota on 15 counts of mail fraud, 2 counts of wire fraud, and 1 count of using a fictitious name in schemes. McLaughlin had been collecting money for various imaginary religious orders and projects, including the building of a Catholic school, a basilica, a seminary, a children's hospice, a drug rehab center, and a home for unwed mothers and their babies. From 1983 to 85, he had received over $10,000 in donations from a number of states. He was arrested in New Mexico, where he had recently moved. He pled guilty and was sentenced to 6 months imprisonment. McLaughlin was a priest at the shrine from 1981 to 83, roughly coinciding with the De Benedetto era. While in Necedah, he went by Father Peter and Father Michael. In 1982, he was sent to Cincinnati by De Benedetto for unclear reasons. When he returned, a few months later, they got into quarrels, and McLaughlin was excommunicated. He went to New Jersey, where he was arrested in a department store bathroom for touching a young boy. He fled to Cincinnati, where he started up a new traditionalist Catholic group with some former Necedah associates. At this time, he started calling himself a seer of the Virgin Mary, and claiming he had experienced the stigmata, going by his most well-known alias, Father X. In May 1984, McLaughlin and his followers made for Orion, North Dakota, in order to acquire land for his fake order of religious brothers and sisters. By 1986, most of his followers had become disillusioned with his grift, essentially disbanding his mini-cult. He went to North Carolina, and then Albuquerque, then Cañon, New Mexico, where he was arrested. In 1988, Father X was released from jail on probation, which got him right back on his bullshit. In 1990, he requested his probation be ended early so he could move to California, but was unsurprisingly denied. He went to California anyway, and was arrested for lewd conduct in Bakersfield. By 1993, he was back in North Dakota, trying to incorporate another fake monastery. He seems to have gathered some followers by this time, including a few people who he had known since the early 80s. However, he was now embroiled in a dispute with one of his former cronies, Peter Knowles Smith. Knowles Smith was a Kiwi physician who had lived in the Dakotas for a few decades. Why would you move from New Zealand to the Dakotas? And had encouraged McLaughlin to move his operations to the town of New Rockford. He was the president of Our Lady of Victory International Shrine, which was headquartered in his front yard. McLaughlin and Knowles Smith couldn't agree on whether to build a new monastery or a basilica to the Virgin Mary, and McLaughlin tried to kick Knowles Smith off of the shrine's board. Both reportedly lawyered up and filed suits against each other, but Sawyer couldn't find out what came out of that. Father X was last reported in 2001, possibly living in Greenburgh, Pennsylvania, and still calling himself a priest and scamming Catholic grandmas. From there, the trail goes cold. Gary McLaughlin claimed he saw apparitions of the Virgin Mary and had the stigmata. He solicited money on behalf of an imaginary home for unwed mothers and babies and started numerous fake religious orders, some of which even had members. It's not hard to see where his inspiration for the grift came from. Since the big split in 1983, the Necedah Shrine has been steadily declining. It no longer holds a monopoly on Juneau County politics, nor brings in crowds of thousands. The House of Prayer still isn't finished. But they're chugging along, paying for copious amounts of ads in local newspapers. Let's tie up some loose ends. Today, if you go to Google Maps and look at Necedah, a couple of things stand out. There's the shrine, of course, which has a thrift shop and a religious goods store nearby. There's also a K-12 school? Queen of the Holy Rosary School was established in 1982, presumably as the reorganized successor to the parochial school of years prior. It seems to have had around 30 students and 10 faculty, and they rely entirely on volunteer work. Interestingly, they offer Chinese, along with Spanish and Latin, as foreign languages. The school is operated out of what used to be the St. Francis of Assisi's Home for Unfortunate Men, an institution started by the shrine in 1978. Although the building could house up to 160 men, it only ever housed a few at a time. There's not a lot to say about it, unlike the infant's home. Little information about this school's operations is available, and they're perpetually hiring, if any of you want the weirdest job of your life. Also on Google Maps, in the old Shrine Belt part of town is something curiously called the Santa Maria Rosa Mystica Catholic Church, Eastern Rite. Based on obituaries, it's existed since at least 2000. Although sources of information on this church are scarce, there is a lot to unpack. Santa Maria Rosa Mystica Catholic Church, Eastern Rite, hereafter just Rosa Mystica, advertises itself as offering the Latin Tridentine Mass with Gregorian chant, but also by calling itself Eastern Rite, claims to be affiliated with the Byzantine Christian tradition. See, I said it right this time. This isn't a video about different liturgical traditions in Christianity, but those two things are not really compatible. The Tridentine Mass, the primary Latin Mass used in the Catholic Church from the 16th century until Vatican II, and Gregorian chant are firmly Western, exclusively associated with the Latin Catholic Church headed by the Pope in Rome. Byzantine Christianity, however, is the broad grouping of Greek-derived liturgical traditions found in the Eastern Orthodox and Eastern Catholic churches. The main primary source of information on Rosa Mystica is an odd YouTube video they link on their website. The video is worth a watch in itself because it's really weird, but I'll summarize it here. It seems to be a re-upload of some kind of TV program, perhaps broadcast in Poland, consisting mainly of footage of the two leaders of the church talking to the camera. In the video, they sort of vaguely claim to be Eastern Catholic, Christian churches that mostly follow Byzantine liturgical traditions but are in communion with the Pope, but seem unsure about it. The website doesn't say anything about the Necedah Shrine, but the video makes the connection obvious. They talk about the Rosa Mystica Church as a place where people, quote,
they can come to our church if they choose to come to the shrine and say some rosary, say some prayers, sing some hymns. They have no fear that they can't go to confession, they can't go to communion, or in case of sickness, receive the last rites. They can do that with no fear at all, because we will not ostracize them.
It's kind of sad and sweet. You'll get the sense from this video that this church is an attempt by those still adhering to the shrine to gain some shred of legitimacy in the mainstream Catholic Church. Since 1950, they've never given up on trying to get official recognition. There were those stints of affiliation with old Catholicism, but that was brief. Lots of schismatic Catholic cults full send on the hardcore set of vacantism, completely rejecting the legitimacy of the Pope and the church hierarchy. Necedah, though, never has. In the video, they seem to recognize Popes Benedict and Francis as legitimate and praise their outreach efforts with the Eastern churches. Likewise, they claim to be Eastern Catholic explicitly because they think it means the Catholic Church has to recognize their rights as valid. That's not how it works, but it's a transparent grasp at straws to get that recognition. A key focus of Rosa Mystica is Orthodox Catholic unity and healing of the 1054 AD schism, which has not historically been a major preoccupation of the Vanhoof cult. However, it does have some precedent. As mentioned toward the start, Marianne had a bunch of visions of Tsar Alexander III, who is the supposed supernatural source of many of the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories promoted by the shrine, and who told her about how the Yiddish nihilists wanted to destroy both Orthodoxy and Catholicism. When she called Russia the most Catholic nation, that probably wasn't just because she was bad at history. Marianne said that the Virgin Mary greatly desired Orthodox Catholic unity and told her that the two traditions united would defeat Satan. Marianne envisioned some sort of monument to these visions, which never materialized. In classic Necedah fashion, there's also a bunch of fascinating apocalyptic predictions, such as,
and be ready for this to be a place of refuge in the days of the future for the Midwest, where people like yourself living in Chicago and other places can come here when things get bad, and you'll be protected here much more than you would be if you remained in the great cities, because we are told by Our Lady, unless many more prayers are said, nuclear bombs will be going off in the future. I'm not here to scare you, but this is what Our Lady says. There will be unbelievable earthquakes, that California may be completely gone. California, Oregon, and Washington, a lot of them will be completely gone, and the Pacific coast may start around Colorado. This is what is in store for us.
Rosa Mystica seems to have some kind of connection to a very similar organization called Holy Love Ministries, based out of Cleveland. Holy Love Ministries has an endorsement on their website from Archbishop Stanley Monaghan, one of the heads of Rosa Mystica. Since 1999, Holy Love Ministries has been condemned multiple times by the mainstream Catholic Diocese of Cleveland. Also in Necedah is the Our Lady of Victory Chapel, which belongs to the Society of St. Pius X, a semi-schismatic traditionalist Catholic organization dedicated to preserving the pre-Vatican II Latin Mass. Sawyer could not find any information about this chapel or when it was established beyond its presence on Google Maps, but thought it was worth mentioning. It probably exists to serve the Shrine Belt's desire for the Tridentine Latin Mass. We can gather some information about the current operations of the shrine based on publicly available tax information. For My God and My Country, Inc. is still around, still bringing in tens of thousands of dollars, mostly in donations, although operating at a loss. The Infant's Home might still be in operation, although they haven't filed tax forms since 2012. As of 2012, they were operating at a profit, apparently. The house it operated out of is still there, but the sign has been removed. I can't imagine much is going on there these days. There are also two mysterious organizations listed on ProPublica's nonprofit directory with zero information available. Oblates of St. Therese of the Holy Child Jesus of Wisconsin Limited, tax exempt since 1995, and Through the Twin Hearts, Inc., tax exempt since 2002. It's unclear what these are, and Google search brings up nothing, but based on the names and location, it's safe to assume they're associated with the shrine in some way. Rob Fixmer described Edward Salick's mysterious life as a convoluted tapestry woven out of long stories that somehow never meshed. The same can be said of the story of the Necedah Shrine as a whole. So many characters appear and disappear inexplicably. So many threads go nowhere. What happened to Ed Stalick? Or David Edward Schott, Glenn Gergen, Francis Di Benedetto, Father X? Who the hell was the little pebble? We may never know. Just southeast of the Necedah Shrine, there's a strange homemade tower. It doesn't seem to be connected to the shrine in any way, so it doesn't fit into the rest of the video, but Sawyer thought it was interesting enough to mention. It looks like a fantastical woodland hideout in a Miyazaki movie. Locals claim it originally had a hotel room in it that was briefly bookable on Airbnb. There were now deleted Facebook pages and Blogspot blogs promoting it, and a YouTube channel that originally shared a few videos of it. The channel still exists, but mostly shares dashcam videos of long, snowy drives in rural Wisconsin. Anecdotes from locals suggest the man behind the tower was a practicing Hindu who built it as a Hindu temple, and some of his blogs do suggest that, although I think he's best described as less of a true Hindu and more of an American New Ager, someone who is to Hinduism as Maryanne Vanhoof was to Catholicism. He also predicts an impending World War III. He seems to have ended up in this particular town by coincidence. Rumors hold that the tower was condemned for violating building codes. Last night, before I recorded this episode, I was watching the HBO Florida Man show with my girlfriend, and we had a conversation about Florida men. A few years ago, there was a trend where you can look up your birthday and Florida Man and find an outrageous story for any day of the year. Here's mine. In 2022, a Florida man tried to break into the Cape Canaveral NASA base and warn the astronauts about a war between aliens and Chinese dragons. Also on my birthday, in 2007, a Florida man was arrested for selling alligator meat. And I can't be the first person to wonder, what the fuck is going on in Florida? Why does Florida specifically attract all these weirdos? Well, part of Florida Man is a real phenomenon. Florida is a global vacation destination, and one associated with drinking and partying and being stupid. The weather is nice, so it's easy to be homeless, so drifters end up there. There are high rates of crime and drug use. It's also the third most populous state, and more people equals more news. But none of that fully explains Florida Man. The proximate cause is that Florida has unusually strong government transparency laws, known as the Sunshine Laws, making every arrest in the state public information. The vast majority of Florida man-like shenanigans are matched by equivalent insanity in the 49 other states that we just don't know about. America is weird. Americans are weird. Humanity is weird. Sometimes in awful ways, but more often in ways that are just whimsical and ridiculous. That New Age tower guy wasn't hurting anyone, and we'd never have heard about him if we hadn't been talking about a completely different oddity in the same little town, itself not well documented on the internet or in the mainstream media until now. Sawyer and I both spent time in that same part of Wisconsin. He grew up in Madison, I worked on the Kamala Harris campaign in Platteville and Prairie du Chien, and I heard about the Necedah Shrine from locals, which is what encouraged Sawyer and I to spend months researching it. We'd never have heard of it otherwise. I read a blog post a while ago that I can't find anymore that talks about re-haunting the world. The premise is, long ago, everyone practiced animist religions that ascribed a spiritual significance to every spot. Everyone in your village knew that this rock is where your people's demigod founder killed a demon when the world was young. This river is controlled by a mischievous spirit who makes it flood every spring. And now we've classified and formalized everything, and now a rock is just a rock, and a river is just a river. The world is no longer haunted by myth and magic. And that's a shame. It's a lovely sentiment, but I discover stories like this and I realize this is already a haunted world, in all the best ways. Turn over stones in your own backyard, and you'll discover a universe of stories.
Believe in something right, but you do something wrong. A loaded question will break your bones. What puts you on your knees? You paint the walls in red, the color of your heart. But the man in grey won't get you now. You've got to hide or take the blame. want to reach your friends, but the brain